From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI. On July 9th through 11th, Washington will host the leaders of NATO's 32 member states for a special anniversary summit celebrating 75 years since the alliance's founding. But the NATO heads of state and government are unlikely to spend much time reminiscing. Their agenda will be full, spanning from Ukraine, Russia, wars in the Middle East, China, terrorism, cyber threats, NATO enlargement, boosting allied capabilities, freedom of navigation around the world, nuclear deterrence, and more. In today's episode, we're going to focus on just two, albeit broad topics: security in the wider Black Sea region and NATO's policy toward the Middle East and Africa. I have two excellent guests who will help us think through these issues. Please stay tuned. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. I'm joined today by Drs. Iulia-Sabina Joja and Emiliano Alessandri. Iulia is the director of MEI's Black Sea program. Formerly, she was deputy project manager at NATO Allied Command Transformation in Virginia and an advisor to the Romanian president. Whereas Emiliano is a non-resident scholar at MEI and an international affairs expert with a focus on Euro-Atlantic security and the interplay between security dynamics in Europe and the Middle East and North Africa. Iulia and Emiliano, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Iulia, let me begin with you. What will be the main issues on NATO's agenda at the Washington summit, and what can we expect to come out of this meeting of alliance leaders?
Well, I think it's a question of issues on the one hand, and then things that we are celebrating on the other end. And that relationship has been a bit of a tension over the last few months as Washington has started with member states of NATO to plan for the summit. So when it comes to the issues, obviously it's going to be Russia and Ukraine, number 1, 2, 3 in terms of issues. And then we'll hear from Emiliano and from others too in the coming days and weeks about the other issues that are on the agenda. Ukraine, Russia, sort of the eastern dimension of NATO will be just one of several. But what I was referring to a bit earlier with this tension is that on the other end, we have had now 2.5 years of the largest war on European ground in 70 years since World War II. And that has been dealt with in matters that we can discuss over the past 2 years at the summits, with some good and some less good feedback in this relationship between the alliance and Russia on the other end, and of course, Ukraine on the other end. But what is planned, or what is rumored to be planned for the next few days into the summit, is also a big celebration of 75 years of this unprecedented alliance. And so this is the tension that I'm talking about, that on the one end, we're looking back and there's a lot to be celebrating. And the alliance is providing for security for its members. But on the other end, the alliance has been sort of central to the war by Russia in Ukraine. And we are in a moment in which there is not a clear end in sight, and neither is it clear who is on the winning side in this war.
According to many experts, NATO wants to avoid the anger and frustration of last year's summit, where Ukraine pushed hard for membership, but the alliance was not ready to offer it. And this year, expectations on all sides are much more sober, and reports suggest the allies will instead work to offer a package of initiatives that will serve as a clear bridge toward membership. What does that mean, Iulia, and what will or won't Kiev be offered at the summit?
So you're entirely right that it looks like almost certainly membership will not be on the table, similarly to last year. And last year was a bit of a PR fiasco too on the Allied side because of the takeaways from the summit and exactly that relationship of tension. So what I've heard, and I think I'm not the only one in these months preparing for the summit, what I've heard from officials here in Washington, D.C., but also from allied partners and countries across the Atlantic, is that a package will be prepared for Ukraine that is not going to be membership, but that is going to get as close to it as possible. the details of this package are not yet clear, even a few days before the summit. It's something that particularly the Biden administration has been attempting to lead in preparing. On the other hand, however, it's quite complicated because we don't know what can be NATOized in terms of aid for Ukraine. It's important here to note that though we have NATO member states providing the absolute majority of aid for Ukraine in this war, it is not the alliance so far that has been doing it, but rather on a bilateral level. And we have member states of the alliance that refuse to provide military aid for Ukraine or even to impose sanctions on Russia. That's not something that NATO has been doing. And so over the past few months, in preparation of the summit, we've seen the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, attempting to what we call now NATOize aid for Ukraine, to put together a package he initially suggested of about $100 billion that would enable long-term aid for Ukraine and get Ukraine closer to winning, frankly, this war. And we've already seen the member states that have not been aiding militarily Ukraine on a bilateral level expressed at least reluctance, to use a diplomatic term, about this. So we don't know exactly to what extent aid for Ukraine as a commitment of the collective alliance will become part of the alliance and part of the summit decisions in the coming days as we're preparing for the summit. We know Ukraine will get aid. We know almost certainly it will not get membership this year, but we do not know exactly what the shape of this aid will be, either in quality or in quantity, or even when it comes to the time frame.
Another important item on the agenda this year will be the adoption of a Southern strategy for the alliance. Emiliano, turning to you, can you describe for our audience what prompted this initiative at this time? How has that process unfolded, and what can we expect the final document to cover? And how will it actually be used by the alliance?
Thank you, Matt, for having me. And, Julia is right. The NATO summit will be about the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the alliance, and Ukraine will be front and center of all discussions. But NATO will also deal with the South. This is something not new, really. And the final communiqué, in some ways, will reiterate principles and views that have been already included in previous communiques, including at the Vilnius summit last year. NATO's engagement with the South is a long-standing one. People tend to forget the first time and only time NATO Article 5, the mutual defense clause, was invoked was after 9/11, the terrorist attacks on the US, and NATO operationalized Article 5 through a number of initiatives, most notably with its engagement in Afghanistan and then with operations also in the Mediterranean Sea. Going further back into the Cold War era, NATO, from the very beginning, we're celebrating the 75th anniversary, included among its member Mediterranean-oriented Portugal, but also Italy, a Mediterranean country in all respects. And in 1952, Greece and Turkey joined the alliance, making the North Atlantic Treaty much more than an Atlantic community, but an Atlantic Mediterranean one. What is new now and what triggered this process? On the one hand, there are some anniversaries this year when it comes to the South as well. It's the 30th anniversary of the Mediterranean dialogue that NATO launched in 1994-1995 with a number of countries from North Africa and the Middle East. And it's also the 20th anniversary of the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative that NATO launched in 2004, a few years after 9/11. But apart from the anniversaries, the allies feel a need, of course, some of them more than others, to take a close look at what is happening in the South. Because the South has been, for a number of years, as we know, a source of transnational and transboundary threats, but it's also now the theater of very real strategic competition. And I'm not only talking about Iran and its regional aims, but also Russia's growing presence in North Africa and across Africa, as well as Syria and the Middle East. And already in 2022, the year Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and NATO adopted the new strategic concept at the Madrid summit, with a strong push from Spain, NATO leaders agreed that the Mediterranean policy, in a way, the southern policy of NATO, had to be taken into consideration again. In 2023, at the Vilnius summit, that became a sort of formal tasking, and the Secretary General Stoltenberg followed up on that, appointing an independent group of 11 experts, which delivered a very rich report earlier this year. The report was presented to NATO leaders already in March. It was then reviewed and published in May. It contains a broad list of recommendations, short-term, long-term, as well as a lot of analysis of what has been missing, what can be done better. And we can go into that if you want.
Thank you, Emiliano. In anticipation of the NATO summit, MEI has published a 5-part series of articles assessing NATO's approaches toward the Black Sea region on the one hand and the southern neighborhood on the other. I would encourage our listeners to look at these on our website, mei.edu. You can find all of this analysis and recommendations from our authors, which include Iulia and Emiliano, under the heading Shoring Up NATO's Vulnerable Flanks. One of the points that comes up again and again in this series from several of the authors of our NATO's Vulnerable Flanks article series is that Libya is a key unresolved issue. The Libyan civil war breeds instability in the wider region. It proliferates weapons and fighters to insurgencies in the Sahel. It serves as a crucial base of operations for Russia and its destabilizing activities across the continent. It's a theater of conflict and competition not only for regional actors like the UAE or Qatar, but also NATO allies like Turkey, Italy, and France. With that in mind, Emiliano, how do you see the situation in Libya and its security implications for NATO, and what role should NATO or its individual members play there?
Thank you, Matt, for bringing up Libya. And I think Libya is a great case for showing the opportunities, but also the challenges and the constraints that NATO faces when looking south. As we all remember, NATO got engaged in Libya in 2011 in the context of the civil war with a military operation that lasts several months and was completed with the overthrow of the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. That operation was then criticized and became very controversial and has become the standard target of criticism of a whole bunch of NATO detractors in the global south, to simplify, but also in Europe, who have been criticizing NATO for a militaristic approach and foreign meddling. The legacy of that operation is still haunting NATO in many respects. NATO doesn't really have a lot of engagement with Libya right now, which remains a deeply divided country, not only regionally. It's really a division between factions and tribes, and the situation isn't getting any better. We all know that the UN has sent a number of special envoys to Libya to try to broker a political solution to the tensions that still keep the country from fully stabilizing after the civil war. And these special envoys have all failed. The last one, Senegalese, resigned just a couple of months ago. And he pointed his finger at not only the reluctance of different factions and parties to come to a solution. We have to remember Libya hasn't had an election for many, many years, since 2014. But he also very explicitly called out a number of countries that are basically playing a proxy competition and fueling what remains a conflict in the central Mediterranean. And this is exactly one big challenge for NATO. Not only a controversial military operation that has left a very mixed legacy, to say the least, in the region about NATO, but the fact that different NATO countries, I'm talking about some European countries in particular, have pursued not fully aligned interests when it comes to Libya. They all nominally agree that there should be a unified political authority in the country, and they all support the UN process, but they have had different nuances and emphases and different approaches to different militias and different groups. And above all, they're pursuing different economic interests. And these economic interests have become even more important in light of the war in Ukraine that we have already talked about, because of Europe trying to wean itself off its dependency on Russian fossil fuel. Europe has looked at the Middle East and North Africa and the Gulf, of course, as alternatives, and Libya stands out and was already a key partner in the region for Europe. So all these economic interests play a big role in these differences and discrepancies that exist within NATO. At the same time, you pointed out, Libya is not only a divided country that needs stability more than ever as the economic situation is getting worse, not better, but it's also a country where Russia's presence is growing in the form of ever more permanent military bases. And there's very little, in my view, NATO can do at present to prevent that. I think effort should go in the direction of coordinating as much as possible a common position, not just within NATO as an organization, but among Western allies. And for that to happen, you need to have clarity about Washington's position. And until we are in November and we know who will be the next president of the United States, that questions, I'm afraid, remains open. So there are issues on the European side of the equation, on the US side of the equation, and at the same time, Libya remains this sort of wide spot of instability in the central Mediterranean. I think it's 20,000 deaths from people departing from Libya across the Mediterranean Sea since 2014. So it's a weekly, daily tragedy at sea. Human rights are being violated in the country. And European Union countries themselves don't know exactly how to deal with authorities in the country. They have been training and supporting the Coast Guard of Libya, for instance, in place of NATO. So there's, of course, also a division of role with the European Union that needs to be worked out. But, of course, the Libyan Coast Guard has yet to reach the standards, the international standards, not only of effectiveness, but above all of human rights compliance that one would want to see.
Thank you. We just very briefly alluded to Turkey's engagement in Libya, but of course, Turkey is also a key player in the Black Sea region. So, Iulia, turning back to you, how would you assess Turkey's role in containing the Russo-Ukrainian war, but also its broader contribution to the alliance in helping maintain security in the Black Sea? And if I could throw in one other topic here, how much of a problem for the rest of NATO is Turkish President Erdogan's relationship with Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, so the way you formulated these questions, it's already clear without me even giving an answer that it's a complicated matter and that Turkey has a complicated but very important role to play in the alliance, particularly when it comes to Black Sea security and the war in Ukraine. And I've just returned from a research trip for my book, including Turkey around the Black Sea region, where I look at great power competition or strategic competition. And I talked to a number of former high-ranking military and diplomats who have all been part of this process of designing and reinforcing Turkey's Black Sea policy. And so the way we stand now, if we're looking at Turkey 2.5 years into the war, is that Turkey manages to be, it's also not an EU member state, but a NATO member state. So it manages not to impose sanctions on Russia. Trade with Russia is, because of this constancy, a key part of Black Sea, continues to be of Black Sea trades, despite heavy sanctions from the EU and the United States against Russia. And one high-ranking former military in Turkey told me, NATO should be grateful for the fact that Turkey can play this mediating role that it is keen to play between Russia on the one hand and the West on the other end. And if we're looking at it from this perspective, indeed, Turkey has been the NATO country that Russia has trusted enough. Russia under Putin has trusted enough to be able to play this mediating role, including in the initial grain deal that has now exactly a year ago fallen apart due to Russia's withdrawal from it. And so that indeed is a key part of Turkey in the Black Sea. But in the medium and long term, including in the context of we need more Black Sea security from the alliance, Turkey will have to be confronted with the new realities on the ground in the Black Sea region. The truth is that pre-Erdogan, and this has been a constant during Erdogan's stay in power over the last more than a decade, almost two, is that Turkey has maintained its policy of wanting to keep the Black Sea, as it says, away from external powers or external powers out of the Black Sea. Read the West, right? The United States, the UK, France, other naval powers. And the aim of that has been for Turkish national interest to keep the Black Sea quiet, to not have too much agitation, presuming that has been the presumption all this time, that if the West stays out, there will not be that much conflict and the Black Sea will be sort of divided in power, essentially between Turkey and Russia. Well, that hasn't worked out too well if we're looking at the last few years. And even Erdogan himself several years ago warned the alliance that the Black Sea is being turned by Russia into a Russian lake. And we're not that far away from this warning. And so the question will be, medium to long term, given the current balance of power, how Turkey will navigate this relationship, whether it will succeed in being a mediator at some point in this conflict, and whether it will reassess its Black Sea policy to realize that national interests of Turkey are to actually push against Russia, because otherwise Russia is dominating too much of a region where Turkey has a major stake as well. So the one thing is where Turkey lies today, and that's complicated, but it's also that Turkey will be forced by circumstances in the months and rather years to come to figure out what it wants, what kind of a power balance it wants in the Black Sea.
Sticking with the region, Iulia, you wrote a piece for our article series outlining what a NATO strategy toward the Black Sea should look like. Could you provide our listeners with some highlights from your piece? And why do you think the alliance has continued to underperform in addressing the security situation in the Black Sea? And why has it yet to adopt a formal strategy toward the region?
Yeah, it's the question of who is hiding behind whose back. We just talked about Turkey, but I've heard in the region from experts, not just from Turkey, but in other places too, that I travel to, that sometimes the United States is accused of hiding behind Turkey. And we've seen the United States over the past few years certainly leading in the aid for Ukraine, but that lead has been restrained. And 2.5 years into the war, we do not have, under this leadership, a clear outline of when and how this war is going to end. And so with that in mind, that might explain also why we do not have at the NATO level, where there's even less or more diluted by definition political will, because we have several equally standing with rights of veto member states, why we do not have a Black Sea strategy. In the United States, we now do have a Black Sea strategy, intergovernmental attempts and successes of developing a regional strategy that is much needed, but that's a relatively new element in the national policy from the United States perspective onto the region. At the NATO level, we still yet have to develop a collectively agreed Black Sea policy, and there's no consensus on the big issues from Ukraine's membership. That's how we started our conversation today, all the way to the policy vis-a-vis Russia, medium to long term. There is no agreement. And that's why we still do not have a clearly assumed outcome or an ideal outcome that the West is pursuing in this war. And so we have reluctance when it comes to membership from some member states of Ukraine. We have countries that are reluctantly imposing sanctions on Russia, countries that are not helping Ukraine militarily. And in the absence of consensus when it comes to Ukraine, it's very difficult then, and when it comes to Russia, it's very difficult then to design a collectively assumed Black Sea strategy. But what I'm trying to highlight in this paper is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch. I'm trying to highlight the elements that we already have with the commitment of the United States primarily, but increasingly, particularly over the last 2.5 years, also of other NATO member states, commitments on the ground that we just need to develop into a cohesive strategy. And at the same time, we need to take important steps and necessary steps to design a collectively assumed NATO Black Sea policy. So for more details on that, as well as on the nuances of how we can stay within international law and at the same time pursue more security regionally and for the alliance overall, my recommendation then is to check out our papers.
Thank you. Given the situation in Ukraine and the Middle East, the question of NATO's nuclear deterrence will undoubtedly come up again. Do you foresee that the summit deliberations will lead to any notable changes to the alliance's nuclear posture or its members' efforts to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon? Emiliano, can I start with you?
For sure, Matt, nuclear deterrence and deterrence more broadly will be at the center of discussions in Washington, and we can expect stronger language than in previous communiques. I'm not so sure that the discussion about Iran is at a stage where concrete operational taskings will come out of the summit. I think there will be a renewed focus on Iran more broadly because of the actions Iran has taken in recent months in the region, including a direct attack on Israel in the context of the ongoing Gaza war. The attack was successfully rejected and neutralized, also thanks to the help of some of the Mediterranean dialogue partners of NATO. So I think missile defense, aerial defense, ballistic capabilities, cooperation in missile defense, these are all topics that NATO, with caution, because they're extremely politically, not only strategically sensitive topic. These are topics that NATO can start sharing and engaging with, not only internally, of course, it's done for decades, but also when it comes to its partners for cooperation. The NATO missile defense system is currently partly sea-based. That's an important aspect. That's in itself an evolution of the missile defense system of NATO. The Obama administration impressed a very important acceleration and change in that respect from the Bush years. So there is a clear Mediterranean component to missile defense, and non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction will remain a top priority in the discussions within NATO, but also in the discussions between NATO and the Gulf. The Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, we didn't go into that yet, but as an important chapter that is countering WMDs. If I may say and take advantage of me talking to say a few more things about possible deliverables at the summit when it comes to the South. As I was saying at the beginning, there will be language, in my view, in the final communique to the effect that the interdependence between the North Atlantic and European regions and the Mediterranean African one, this interdependence has become only deeper and more relevant and more strategically consequential. I'm not really sure there will be a strategy per se, a real document adopted. That might actually be one of the taskings for the newly appointed Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Rutte, who may follow up on this very rich report that I referenced to and try to figure out what a Mediterranean or southern strategy of NATO may look like. I think at this stage, with the politics within the alliance and the politics around the world, it's already an important achievement if NATO leaders convening in Washington in just a few days can agree on new, powerful language about engaging the South, while they're, of course, keeping their eyes focused on the situation in Ukraine and upgrading NATO's coordinating role when it comes to everything that has to do with collective defense and deterrence. On a number of specific issues, functional issues, where NATO has been engaged for a very long time, maritime security is one. I think NATO can already from this summit receive more clear taskings and upgraded role. That's hopefully going to be the case. But to really see a full-fledged strategy, there has to be still a lot of coordination within NATO and a little bit more clarity after the U.S. presidential elections in November.
Iulia, were there any other final points that you wanted to make before we conclude?
I think Emiliano summed it up pretty well, that we should manage our expectations, that we already have important things on the ground, particularly ballistic missile defense, but that we should be expecting some change in language. And I think one point I'd like to draw on that shows how challenging this is for NATO to address before the US elections that Emiliano just referred to, and also after, in the context of the increasingly complex threats that the alliance is facing. Years ago, when you would Google ballistic missile defense in the Romanian language, Romania is one of the main hosts of ballistic missile defense that is supposed to be protecting European allies from an Iranian attack, you would get the first 2 pages of results being directly or indirectly sponsored by the Kremlin in terms of disinformation, how ballistic missile defense is the main source of a threat for countries hosting, such as Romania. What I want to show with this example is that Iran and Russia, particularly in the context of the full-scale invasion, are increasingly working together. This has been acknowledged as such, including by NATO leadership and beyond, and that the alliance will have to increasingly think about its defense, including nuclear defense or ballistic missile defense against possible nuclear aggression, by thinking in a combined manner about threats stemming from the east, Russia, as well as stemming from the south or southeast, Iran. And we've seen on the Russian end an adjustment of the nuclear posture, with Russia announcing that it is hosting now, or it is sending nuclear weapons to Belarus. So we see a change in posture on that end. We do not know on Iran as much. They're not as, of course, developed, but that triggers the alliance, or should trigger the alliance in the context of this upcoming summit, to again readjust its rhetoric and its posture vis-a-vis the threats that are coming from Iran as well as from Russia.
Thank you. Again, I highly recommend that our listeners go to MEI's website, find the link to our special series, Shoring Up NATO's Vulnerable Flanks, and check out Emiliano's and Iulia's excellent pieces along with the rest of the related articles. But beyond those, is there anything else the two of you would like to plug or preview for our audience? Iulia, let me start with you.
Just to read not just our pieces, of course, but the entire series that Matt, you and your colleagues have worked really hard on, and that we've been planning for a while, exactly to show our audiences, as well as those that are following the NATO summit, that we should have high expectations from the NATO summit, but that this is just one landmark, and that there's a lot of work to be looking ahead to, particularly when we're looking at this intersection between the southern dimension, the Middle East, and the eastern dimension, Central and Eastern Europe, and of course, Russia. And so within this larger framework, I can only recommend, of course, those who are listening will be looking into the summit as well and what is coming out of the summit, but also to keep an eye on our series and what we're doing generally in the coming months as well at the Middle East Institute with the work of Emiliano and many others to understand better and offer more analysis and policy recommendations for the transatlantic space when it's looking south as well as when it's looking east.
And Emiliano, anything else you would like to highlight?
I can only support what Iulia said. And, let me also add that we should always remember that NATO is a political alliance and also an organization. And at these summits, a lot of political decisions will be made. And it's difficult. It's 32 members now. And there's a lot of change and a lot of politics in Europe. Look at what is happening in France. Look at what is happening in the UK. A lot of developments. And so it's difficult, even if there is a very high common denominator, right? A lot of unity on some issues, is still difficult to make groundbreaking decisions. But then there is the organization of NATO that has been around for 74 years. The organization was created a year later after the North Atlantic Treaty was signed in Washington in 1949. And this organization has delivered amazing results, over the decades, implementing these political decisions and taking them forward with a wealth of initiatives. And I think that's what our readers and our audience and our followers should focus on after the summit. how some of these decisions will be picked up by the new NATO leadership over the coming months and the many executive structures of NATO, and turning them into a number of initiatives that will probably not catch, the headlines, but they're still very important. So my advice is keep following NATO, both when it comes to its politics, but also when it comes to its operational reality. I mean, this is a multilateralism at its best. It's multilateralism among like-minded. That doesn't mean they have identical views or identical interests. It's negotiation every day, but it's the most successful alliance in history. So my advice is to follow NATO developments at all levels.
Well put, both of you. Unfortunately, we're now out of time, but I appreciate both of you coming on the program. You can follow all of MEI's coverage of NATO's relationship with the wider Middle East, the Black Sea region, and Africa on our website at www.mei.edu. That's all the time we have this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Matthew Czekaj. Please listen in next time.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.